Riot Chapter 15. Hand over hand, Brian shimmied up the weathered rope to his old treehouse. He couldn't go home yet. He needed time to be alone, time to think. Besides, how could he begin to talk, to act normal after what he had seen? He hoisted himself through the square opening and pulled himself up onto the wood floor. Crawling on his hands and knees toward the window, he took off his backpack and rolled onto his back. An aspen branch sprouting yellow and green leaves poked through the crack in the corner, pushing apart the adjoining walls. The fort had taken 2 weekends to build with Dad's help, and now it was falling apart. Flecks of gray rope fiber clung to Brian's hands. He rubbed his palms lightly together over his chest and then stared at the flat ceiling. A small, black spider with gray pouch crawled directly above him. Unflinching, Brian watched it. Heck, what was a spider compared to a swarm of angry men? The spider flattened itself motionless for a few seconds, and then crawled slowly across the ceiling to a hairline crack and disappeared outside. Through the window, morning light drew golden rectangles on the walls. Brian curled his legs up toward his belly, rolled onto his side, and tucked his head down. His eyes grew hot. He felt like a steamroller had crushed his ribs. From deep in his own chest, a sob rose. He let it come, muffling his sounds with his knees. Finally, when he felt like a wrung-out towel, he slept. Brian? Brian opened his eyes and looked at the wood shelves he once hammered together, still holding some of his old paperbacks. Maybe the whole thing had been a bad dream. Brian? Kyle poked his bird's nest of blonde hair through the opening. Good, you're here. When your mom called to ask about you, I figured I better check here. He climbed up onto the floor. She didn't sound too happy. Brian rubbed his eyes. As if they were red, it didn't matter. Did you hear what happened at the housing camp? Kyle nodded. Who hasn't? The mayor was on the radio telling everyone to stay home. I saw smoke from my house. It was really incredible. I just biked by. What a mess. The place is destroyed. I watched the mob, Brian said, his voice flat. I saw everything. Yeah? Kyle sat down cross-legged, excitement in his voice. And I heard those men went out to an apartment building where a family of 12 non-union workers lived. Somebody said a woman with a rifle kept them away, shouting at them in Spanish. Kyle shook his head. Can you believe it? In our town? Brian ran his hand over his backpack, feeling the edges of the video camera. If Kyle knew that Dad had been there, he probably wouldn't think much of his hockey coach anymore. Kyle leaned forward. My dad said the police escorted 2 busloads of men from town. Most of those guys were from out of state, so the town should be safe now. Yeah, Brian said, not looking at him. It wasn't only men from out of town. He remembered Sheriff Hunter pacing behind the fence trying to keep peace and how he'd asked Brian earlier in his office. Brian couldn't just let those men leave town without some sort of justice, not after what they had done. He swallowed hard. I got it all on videotape. You're kidding. Kyle's eyes grew wide. Really? Let's go watch it. Brian crossed his arms over his chest and sighed shakily. I'm in a mess. Why? What do you mean? Kyle, Brian said, my dad was there. Kyle winced and shook his head. Boy, not good, huh? I should turn the tape into the sheriff, but if I do, I'll be turning my dad in at the same time, Brian groaned. So what are you going to do? Kyle asked. Burrs covered Brian's shoelaces and socks, brown puffs with a zillion feathery barbs. How could he turn in his own father? Dad was doing what he probably thought was right. But what if workers had been there sleeping? Isn't that what the men had hoped? How far would Dad have gotten involved? To the point of blood? Standing up for the rights of the union workers was fine, but destroying property and hurting others didn't make sense. Brian picked off a burr and tossed it down the treehouse hole. Maybe he would toss the tape into the woods and pretend he never saw any of it. He remembered the shouts, "No cameras!" Of course they didn't want any cameras. In large numbers, there was no way to identify them, except perhaps from the tape. Kyle, Brian said, last year when my parents went away for their anniversary, I watched a movie at my grandpa and grandma's. It was about Russia. Following World War II, when Stalin sent thousands of Russian people into labor camps. Stalin? Who's he? Like Hitler, only in Russia. Anyway, children were encouraged to turn on their parents. Stalin didn't trust anybody, not even his own people. If children turned in their parents, the Reds would... He caught himself. The communists would praise the children. So? Kyle screwed up his face. I don't get your point. What's that got to do with anything? Brian rubbed his forefinger above his lip and then clenched his hand to a fist. Oh, don't you see? I can't turn in the tape. I'd be turning on my own dad. For another hour they talked. When the shadows filled the tree, Brian grabbed his backpack and pushed the arms through the straps. Kyle, he said, it's getting late. I better get going. He shimmied down the rope, Kyle following.